Today I am in the state of Delaware talking to Michael J. Slinger, who since 2008 has been the law school's Associate Dean for Information Services and Technology and Director of the Legal Information Center. Michael is also a professor of law here at Widener University. Michael, as is sort of our custom, could you start by talking a little bit about what your life was like when you were young and perhaps today?
Sure, Pat. Thanks. And by the way, thank you very much for doing this. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm really honored to be included in this.
Thank you.
In this series.
And we try and select people who are photogenic or whatever. I don't know. What
I don't know how I got it, but
but I'm delighted to be here, Michael. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The oldest of 6 children. Mm-hmm. My father was a steel worker. My mother was a homemaker. And I was really in that first generation of Slingers and Konjerskis, who my mother's maiden name, to send their kids to college. Mm-hmm. And I had the opportunity earlier than that to go to an all-boys high school. Mm-hmm. And that's actually where I started working in the library. So that was sort of starting out my roots, if you will, in librarianship, was working in the library. Because it was an all-boys school, it was actually pretty weird. It was considered to be cool to work in the library. It was considered to be a good job. So it didn't have any stigma attached to, as high school kids often have stigmas attached. There was no stigmas attached to working in the library. Mm-hmm. But I worked for a wonderful man by the name of Phil Baraka, lifelong a school librarian. Mm-hmm. And he spent a lot of time talking to me about this as a possible career, and I never knew it could be a career. So I went off to college, and not surprising, University of Pittsburgh, and not surprising, the first job I got was in the library, in Hillman Library. So I worked there for about a year, and only a year because I found out you could get more money if you worked for the student union moving around tables. So I needed the money, so I went off there, but I didn't forget about the library. Mm-hmm. After, when I was graduating, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I always wanted to go to law school, but I didn't have any money. So I thought, well, maybe librarianship might be a good career move for me. Mm-hmm. So I decided to do that. And so I applied to librarianship, but always in the back of my mind, I thought, if it doesn't work out, maybe I'll be a lawyer, or maybe I'll try to combine the 2 degrees and be a law librarian. Mm-hmm. Although I didn't really know any law librarians at that particular time. It was kind of an interesting story, actually. I applied to a number of library schools, mm-hmm. and one of them was the University of Pittsburgh, another was the University of South Carolina, which was a relatively new school at the time. Mm-hmm. And South Carolina had a rule that you had to interview to go there. And they actually sent me to the University of Pittsburgh to interview because one of their former faculty members was now a faculty member at Pitt. And I had also been accepted at Pitt at this point. But he spent the whole time, and this was in his office in the graduate school, talking to me about why I should go to South Carolina. So
yeah, I was thinking he might have a bit of a conflict of interest, but I would think it'd be the reverse.
Yeah, that's why it was interesting. He kind of convinced me there that was a better place for me to be. Uh-huh. What really cinched it, however, was they gave me a full graduate assistantship, which is wonderful. I'm so indebted to
since you said you're so much like so many fellow students, you're a little low on money. That must have been quite a sweetener to the offer.
Yeah, it was tremendous, and that they would do that for an out-of-state student, really, mm-hmm. It still to this day impresses me. So I always give them a little extra when they ask for.
Maybe that's one of those Republican things. They're big down in that state.
Yeah, it was very different to go to the University of South Carolina, having spent my entire life in Pennsylvania, mm-hmm. and it was a much different place in 1978 when I went there than it was subsequently, mm-hmm. Or it is now, I should say. But I learned a lot of things that were interesting down there. There were some things that were kind of tough to take. It wasn't segregation anymore, but there were a lot of elderly people who still had that kind of feeling that segregation was a good thing. And I remember one incident where I was walking in the downtown area, and there was an elderly African American, and he was walking towards me, and he got off the sidewalk. And that really bothered me because I understood why he was doing
Well,
it.
we all know you were a Yankee from Pennsylvania, and they don't know anything about this sort of thing, but you were learning, I take it.
It's really true. In fact, down there, I had a lot of good friends, but I also thought my name after a while, was Damn Yankee, because I was often called "You Damn Yankee." There weren't a lot of people from the north there at the time, but it was a wonderful place to go to school. And after going to school there, of course, I wanted to be a librarian. And like many people, particularly today, it was hard to find that initial job. So I went back home because I didn't have any living expenses, so I went back to stay with my mother. And during that time, I found there was a temporary opening for a position. It was a one-year appointment at a place called Job Advisory Service, which was located on the campus of Chatham College, which was an all-female college in Pittsburgh. And I was the only male on the staff, certainly, but I was
So
one
you
of
go from an all-boys prep school type environment now to this.
Yes. Of course, I grew up with four sisters. I don't think I mentioned that before. But of my 5 siblings, 4 of them are sisters. So I was pretty used to the all-female environment. But it was a wonderful place to work. What they did there was they worked with women who had been recently divorced and didn't. They've been homemakers, many of them, for many years, and they didn't know what to do with the rest of their lives. And they had counselors there, career counselors, who would work with them to try to figure out, what kind of education they would need, or, how they could improve their lot in life. And many of them were in really sad situations. So it was very rewarding to help them. They put me in the resource center, and what I did was after the counselors would meet with them, I would meet with them, and I would talk to them about ways that they could find information about schools or about careers. The other job they gave me to do was to organize their files, and it was very rewarding. But unfortunately, since my funding ran out in a year, I knew that I was going to have to do something at the end of that year. So I was faced with the situation of trying to find a job as a librarian in a time in which it was difficult to find a job, or go to law school. And so that's what I decided to do. I decided to go to law school.
Postpone the real world a little bit?
I was quite a postponer.
Yeah.
My family used to refer to me as a professional student, and I don't think that was far off.
Well, I felt like a professional student, even though no one maybe called me that, in that I was in college and law school and library school, so it was about 9 years I strung it out, and I felt, this is a long time, but in retrospect, it's a short time.
It was.
Well worth it.
Yeah. Well, you and I followed the exact same trajectory because, except for that 1 year at Job Advisory Service, I was in school continuously until I finished law school. And since I went to law school as an evening student, that was a 4-year experience rather than a 3-year experience. So I was in school a fairly long period of time. So anyway, that basically brings me up to being in law school.
You did that at South Carolina?
No, I was at Duquesne University.
At Duquesne?
Yes.
Oh, back in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. I had come back after graduating and not knowing what to do, and as I said, not having any money to really live on my own. I moved back in with my mother, and
very wise, probably.
Well, it was either that or the streets, so I preferred my
mother's
mother's cooking.
Very wise, and you ate better.
I ate much better. Yes, that's true. So anyway, I ended up at Duquesne because I had an evening program. Pitt didn't have an evening program, and I wanted to go to school in Pittsburgh. By that point, I had gotten married, and we were not exactly settled, but my wife had a job, so it was pretty important that I stay around. But I also wanted to work to supplement the income. So evening, the division made a lot of sense. concurrently, I got a job as a paralegal without any training or experience at a firm that's now a mega firm. At the time, it was Kirkpatrick, Lockhart, Johnson, and Hutchison. Now it's K&L Gates. So it's a very prominent firm. And I guess it was a pretty prominent firm at the time, but nothing like the mega firms, they have today. But it wasn't a job in the library. It was a job as a paralegal. And while I was working there and absolutely hating it, I thought about the fact that, I have a library degree. And so I went to the Duquesne Law Library to talk to Mr. Frank Liu.
Frank, yeah.
Yes, the director of the library.
Yeah.
And I said to him, Mr. Liu, I said, I have a library degree. Is there anything you have for me? And he said, not anything full time. He said, but, if you want to work maybe, part-time, he said, I might be able to do something for you. So I said I'd be glad, to do that. He didn't have a salary to pay me, so interesting, what he did was he went to the administration, and I hope he remembers this. He went to the administration and he got them to give me some financial aid, so like a grant, which was interesting because I think I was the first person at Duquesne in the evening division who actually got some financial aid, because their policy was they didn't give financial aid to evening students because everyone was supposed to have a job.
Yeah.
So he did that for me. I actually moved from Kirkpatrick Lockhart to a small law firm. So I worked for a law firm during the day, went to school at night, and somehow worked at the Duquesne Law Library.
Did the library.
Yeah, and every once
as well.
That's right, Pat. And every once in a while I saw my wife, but not that often.
Well, she was working too, so
she was working.
As your jobs were coordinated, you probably sort of passed now and then.
Well, she used to pick me up. We had one car, so she used to pick me up, and I used to go to school till 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
So she would pick me up at school, and that's when we kind of had our little bit of time together. Because I would either work at the Duquesne Law Library or study on the weekends, because I didn't have any other time to study, basically. So we didn't see each other that much for 4 years, even though we were living in the same apartment. As time got close for me to graduate, I knew that I didn't want to be a practicing lawyer. I'd been working for law firms for 4 years. Now I was working for a litigation firm, and I just didn't enjoy it. I just wasn't really cut out, for that kind of work. But I had the library degree. Now I was going to have the law degree. So I decided, I really liked academia. I really liked research. I thought I should really do this. So I talked to Mr. Liu again, and he was very encouraging to try to do it, but I didn't know how to do it. So what I did was I sent a letter and my resume to about 60 schools. I never saw a job ad. I did that because I thought, maybe there's something out there, but I had no idea.
Yeah.
And so it cost me a lot of postage, but this is the days before computers, so these were all typed letters.
Yes.
So I sent them out, and the places where I thought either I'd like to work or I'd like to live. And I was pretty flexible as far as that was concerned. And I guess I probably got maybe half of them I got responses to. And a couple of them were not very encouraging responses. But lo and behold, 3 of them invited me for interviews.
Well, now that's pretty good. Let's hope it goes beyond that. Huh?
Well, it did, actually. I ended up interviewing at the University of Southern California, where Frank Hodak picked me up at the airport, where I first met him, and we've been friends my entire career, which now going to 30 years, at Villanova and at Notre Dame. And I don't know to this day whether any of them actually had a job posting available or whether they just, invited me to come out for the interview.
Oh, I suspect they had a job. I mean, it's a little hard to justify the expense of bringing someone in if you don't have something to offer.
Interestingly enough, I literally don't know, and I'm sure you're right at USC and Villanova, but Notre Dame didn't have a job. And that's the job I ended up with. They invited me to come out, and they were the only ones that invited my wife to come with me.
Okay.
And I always say I got that job because of my wife, because they loved my wife. Kathy Farman was the director at the time, and her husband Stan was the associate director. and they just really liked my wife Cheryl.
So they liked spousal relationships on them.
They do, and you could kind of see
Apparently.
why. That was an important thing for them. And they offered me a job before I left, and which was stunning to me. So I went back to think about it, and didn't have to think about it very long. I called her and I said, yes, I said, I'll come. And I didn't even know what the salary was. That's how naive I was. She told me the salary and it was acceptable. So I said, okay, I'm coming. And I went to Duquesne to tell Mr. Lou. He's frank to me now, but he was always Mr. Lou at the time.
I'm sure.
Yes.
Or maybe Professor Lou.
He was. We always called him. We always used to call him Mr. Lou.
Okay.
He was a professor, but we always called him Mr. Lou. That was the thing. So anyway, you know, and he was very happy for me, of course. And I went back to my little office, and as I was sitting there, I got a call from Harvard, and they wanted me to come out for an interview.
Oh,
And
another
I
one of
thought
the letters?
Off of the letters. But they were a little late with the letters. And I'd made a promise to Notre Dame, and even though Harvard was not just my dream job in terms of the school, but I always wanted to live in Boston, I had committed, so I regretfully told them, no, I'm going to Notre Dame. So that's how I ended up at Notre Dame.
Well, I don't know what Harvard would have been paying you. You probably don't either.
I have no
At least
idea.
the cost of living, I'm
Yes.
sure, in the Midwest,
Yes.
where Notre Dame was,
Yes.
a tad lower than Boston.
Oh, yeah, and having gone to Boston later on, I certainly know that's the case. But as I said, I was fairly naive, and I didn't even ask what Notre Dame was paying at the time that I was at Notre Dame.
Why couldn't I be interviewing people who, like that? They all seem to have ideas, and I talk to people, but they thought they were worth, and they were pretty accurate.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, you just had to find somebody as naive as I was, I think. But one thing I'd tell you just
Well, you
is
somehow have survived nicely in the field.
things got
Done
better.
well.
Things got better, and they got better at Notre Dame. But I'll tell you one thing that was really interesting, though, is when I was having this run of luck with these interviews, my colleagues, my fellow students, my friends in law school, they were all desperately trying to get law firm interviews with firms in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and so on. And they said, "What are you doing this weekend?" I said, "I'm going to California. You know, all expenses paid." So all of a sudden, everybody started thinking, "Well, maybe I should become a law librarian because this sounds like a pretty good gig." So anyway,
Now, it's sort of customary to ask if there was any key player in helping you decide to be a law librarian. It sounds like you kind of emerged on your own into the field, although perhaps Frank at Duquesne played a role. But would you count anyone as influencing you particularly one way or the other?
You know, I really do think that it was my own invention to do
Okay.
it, but Frank Lou was very supportive. And so I'm very grateful to him for being supportive, and obviously he gave me a little experience, which I think was very helpful in terms of when I sent my resume out, they saw at least I was somewhat conversant about law libraries because I had this part-time job. And I didn't, overinflate it. I said it was a part-time job, and I was maybe working, 10 or 12 hours a week. But he had me working not as a student assistant. He had me working as a reference librarian. So,
Yeah,
so
that doesn't surprise me, knowing Frank, that he would see talent and want to develop it in you. Yeah.
So I'm very grateful to him. But the actual idea was mine, and a lot of it had to do with I thought law librarians would be compatible with what I like to do, and part of it was I just really didn't like the law firm's situation. So.
Well, I can't criticize that. My father was a practitioner out in Seattle, and in those days it was more laid back than it is today, the practice. But even that, our next door neighbor was the dean of the law school at the university, and I liked the lifestyle I saw next door, frankly. Now, I sort of, as a teenager, missed a few of the nuances, like the fact that they had one car and it was fairly elderly, and we had two. And, there were some perks of being in downtown in the law firms, but still, it was part that influenced me to go in this direction as well. Yeah, I liked, there were a lot of university people living in the neighborhood. We were near the university, and in addition to Dean Stevens, George Stevens was next door, there were other professors and some of the other administrative types. And I thought they, from what they said, they had I thought, a very nice quality of life in their work.
Yeah, I'm sure that, well, since having done it, the quality of life is really, really key. I grew up in a very blue-collar town. Very few of the parents of my friends were college graduates, and most of them were steel workers or police and that sort of thing. So didn't really have any role models as far as that was concerned. But fortunately, my parents were very supportive of me not being a steel worker. In fact, I remember my dad taking me aside and saying, I want you to get an education. I don't want you to work in the steel mill. It's really too hard. And so I, always looking to avoid hard work, I
Well, it
took
was
him seriously.
also a good idea. The steel mills have basically closed, and you probably remember the air pollution problems and so on.
Oh, I do.
Pittsburgh is a transformed city now.
I do. In fact, in college, I worked my way through college working for the steel mills in the summertime. And I had, I knew, they had a program where, they had a lot of college students who would come and work. Everyone had a connection to be hired. My dad got me the job, for example. And he said, you can work in the summer, but you're not working beyond that. But a lot of the kids that I worked with dropped out of college because they were making pretty good money and they got full-time jobs there. And within just a few years after I graduated, the mills closed and they were out of work.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a good move for those who chose to stay and do it.
Yeah, it's too bad. Hopefully they've been able to get themselves trained in something now that still is available to work at in this country.
Yeah, I know.
A lot of the old, solid, unionized, blue-collar fields have been offshore. Have been shipped to other countries mostly.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. But I do know a couple of those people did get trained and ended up doing things like robotics and that sort of thing. So they were able to pull out of it. Of course, they were very young at the time. It's much harder now, and it was much harder for people who were older, who were working in the steel mills to find a transition.
Well, Michael, you've sort of described how your career has progressed, and now you're here at Widener. And would you talk a little bit about perhaps some of the things you've done here at Widener and continue to do, and some of your accomplishments, perhaps both in this job and perhaps some of the previous jobs?
Sure, Pat, I'd be glad to. Let me just say, I was at Notre Dame for 6 years, and I really have to tell you about that because I wouldn't be here at Widener if I wasn't at Notre Dame.
All right.
Mrs. Farman was there for 1 year, and then before the first year was up, she announced she was retiring, and they were going to hire a new director, and it turned out to be Roger Jacobs.
Oh, yes, he came from
the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court in Washington.
Yes, and that really, if you ask me, who influenced my career, who made my career, it's Roger.
Okay.
He was my mentor, my friend, my role model, my supporter, everything. So everything I learned, I always say, maybe at least 90% of what I learned from working for Roger. It was a wonderful experience, and Roger taught me what a good law library was and what a good law library director ought to do. And he did promote me as well. He promoted me internally. I kept moving up. I moved from research librarian to associate director for public services. And Roger encouraged me to do scholarship, and I started to get a little bit of recognition for scholarship, particularly because I won a call for papers competition. And I started to get people soliciting me for other associate director positions, and I started to get offered those positions. And Roger kept meeting, matching the salary, and so I stayed. But eventually, I got an offer to interview at Suffolk University in Boston for the director's position. And as I told you before, I always wanted to live in Boston, so that was a big attraction. And the other attraction was, of course, it was a director's position, and I always wanted to be a director.
Now, that was Ed Bander's job.
That was Ed Bander's job.
Was he retiring at that time?
He was retiring.
Okay.
He was still there when I interviewed, and then I replaced him, with the job. And it was an interesting story. When I went to Boston for the interview, as I was about to leave for the airport, I got a terrific migraine headache.
Oh.
So as I was on the plane, I was terrifically sick, and I was perspiring through my clothes and so on. And of course, I was being met at the airport. So when I got into Boston, I was really shaky and sweaty, and I remember going into the restroom and using the blower,
Oh.
the hand dryer, to try to dry myself off a little bit before I met these people. And I don't know how, but somehow I did well enough to get the job offer. And so when I told Roger, he said, I can't match that one. So, I went to Boston.
I suspect what he was really saying was, it's time and this is the job you ought to take.
You're exactly right. In fact,
Yeah.
I think he said
Knowing
something
Roger,
similar to that. Yes.
It wouldn't be dollars and cents, it would be more the
Right.
strategic thinking of your career in the future.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
So I went to Boston, my first director's position, and as I was starting that job, I was like all new directors. I had no idea whether I could actually do it or not.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I could do it if Roger was my boss. I didn't know if I could deal with
It
deans and
does
so
make
on.
it easier to have the real director right down the hall in
It
case
does.
things go awry.
It does, and suddenly there was no one to go to if things went awry. And I remember I had a particularly rough couple of weeks starting out. Had a couple faculty members who were unhappy about something that occurred before I came, and there was some problems with the budget. And I remember sitting in my office and putting my head down on the desk and saying, I made such a mistake, doing this. I'm not cut out for it. And as I did, my secretary, Trish Jardam, knocked on the door. And she opened the door and said, Michael, she said, you have a letter from Roger Jacobs. And I always talked about Roger, so they knew who Roger was.
Sure.
And I opened the letter, and it said, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but basically what he said is, he said, Michael, he said, as you embark on this new adventure, he said, know that I know that you can do this. And he said, and if you have any problems, he said, your old director sits, in South Bend waiting to help. And that did so much for me to encourage
sure
me.
It would.
And it just came, at the exact right moment. So I spent I guess it was 5 years at Suffolk, and liked it, and I think they liked me. I had 2 children by that point,
Oh.
and we had no relatives that were anywhere close to the vicinity. So when Steve Smith, who was the director at Cleveland Marshall, got in touch with me, and I think largely because Roger, I think he asked Roger who he should talk to about their opening as a director of their law library. Steve Smith recruited me for that position, and since Cleveland was only 2 hours from Pittsburgh, which is where all my relatives were, and that's what I was really missing, especially I was concerned my daughters were not going to know anybody in their family because we so seldom were able to get back. I decided to take that job, and then I ended up staying there for 13 years. And it was a great experience. In terms of accomplishments, we were able, both at Suffolk and at Cleveland Marshall, we planned new buildings. I brought Roger's philosophy, which was proactive service. I had my own little twist on that, which was I always believed in the research partnership. I always thought librarians, when they worked directly with faculty members, could really help the faculty members to do better research, or at least make their research easier. And I found that a lot of faculty members really embraced that.
I hear a lot in the conversations such as today's with you, and both on and off camera portions, about the movement as we've gotten into more and more digital information and more stuff that you can access, the role of the librarian and partnering with the faculty member, smile and phrasing, in helping identify what's available to them and how to access it effectively is really become much more the role of many of our colleagues in law librarianship now than it was perhaps even in my generation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I was an early adopter of the idea that maybe faculty didn't know quite as much as we assumed they did, and found out that was true, and they really were looking for assistance. And they were really glad to have us ask. A lot of them, I remember initially would say things like, well, I don't really think I can ask you to do this. And we were like, yes, we really want to work with you.
That was our job.
Exactly. So they didn't quite understand what our job actually was. So they were terrific. Some of them were really terrific partners with us and gave us a lot of credit. And it was really nice when they would write their articles and they would give us the acknowledgments and talk us up. And I remember a meeting where they were talking about they were going to have to cut the budget. Now, something that's so prevalent now, of course, and so serious now, but not as serious then. But nonetheless, you don't want to see your budget cut. And I remember they were having a faculty discussion about that. And the librarians at Notre Dame had faculty status, and we were able to vote with the faculty on everything except for promotions and tenure and hiring, I guess, of faculty. But anyway, I remember they were talking about whether they should cut things in the library. And I remember John Attanasio became a pretty prominent dean. He was a faculty member at the time. I remember him standing up and saying, he said, well, one thing we can't cut is the research librarians. In fact, he said, we need to find out how to hire more research librarians because they're really making a difference in my research. And that really made me, feel good.
That's worth its weight in gold because really in any law school budget, there are really two big pieces, and together they're pretty much most of it. One is the faculty salary base, and the other is the library.
Yes, exactly.
And
right.
you know that when push comes to shove, if the faculty have any say in the thing, they're not going to vote for cutting their own salaries or whatever.
Yes, that's certainly true. On the other hand, though, faculty members who really treasure their scholarship, when they find something that really works for them, that really helps for them, they'll be your advocates, and that's what I found out. You do a good job for them, you work with them, and they're strong advocates for you, and they'll influence the dean, I think, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very helpful technique.
The dean's life is a lot easier if the faculty are happy with whatever's going on.
Yes.
Which is a magic, because then usually the provost isn't.
Yes, you're 100% right on that, Pat. So anyway, so I brought that to all the jobs that I had. And at Cleveland Marshall, I got involved with another phenomenon that's become very much across the board with so many of our colleagues. We didn't have a technology department. And Steve Steinglass, who was really a terrific dean to work for, he came to me and said, Michael, he said, you're a good administrator. He said, I bet you can handle this. And they'd asked me to do this at Suffolk, actually. And I said, no, it's beyond what I really want to do. But at Cleveland Marshall, I just said, Steve asked me, I'm going to do it. So we formed a technology department where one didn't exist before. And so I was suddenly in charge of two areas. I was in charge of the library, but I was also now in charge of all the technology in the law school.
That seems to be a pretty common model now in law schools.
Yeah, it really is. But I think it's a really good thing because it's an example of what librarians do, I think. We're pretty unique creatures in law schools, and we have a lot of talents, and we see where there's holes, and we figure out how to fill those holes. Yeah. And so that's exactly what I was doing there. There's a hole, there's no one else really was better suited to fit it. Like many schools, we didn't have the money to go out and hire someone who was specially trained to do that. So I said I'd do it, and the key always is to hire good people because you don't know exactly what to do yourself in terms of the actual technology. So you hire good people and you give them a lot of encouragement, and you try to give them the support, which I think is really your job. And they do good things, and then quite often it reflects well on you, as well as obviously doing the kind of work that the law school needs.
I used to hear from time to time when this was beginning to happen that libraries were becoming more involved in technology for the institution or for the law school itself. And they would always, concern would be, well, the library is just trying to get all these resources for itself. And yet the reality is, as things have evolved, what the library is providing to faculty and students requires a certain level of technology in today's age. I mean, it's been described that you can sit, as we have behind me, some nice books on the shelf, and the student is sitting there at the table with a screen. He wants to call whatever it is up on his screen, even if the same thing's in paper right behind him. In today's world, it's all it's moved extensively to the digital.
Oh, absolutely. And it's also interesting, as far as moving into leadership role in technology, I think one of the reasons we were able to do that and make that transition was the advent of Westlaw and Lexis. When it came out, the faculty was totally confused by it, and librarians jumped right in and said, we're going to figure out how to use this, and we're going to teach you how to use it. So we developed a certain reputation, probably way overdone in terms of our capabilities to work with technology, but nonetheless, that made it, kind of acceptable, I think, when the dean would turn to you and say, can you expand on this technology role? And a lot of faculty members remembered what you did with Westlaw and Lexis, so they had some confidence that you weren't really empire building, but you were, just helping the school with expertise that they thought you had. Whether you did or not, as I said, is another question. But we always adapt.
Well, as you say, you don't have to know the in and out of the computers and the
Right.
digital, but rather how to be an administrator director.
Right, right, and you have to know to ask the right.
Strategic goals and oversee that aspect
Yeah,
of it.
you have to ask the right questions too. And that's why our profession is so wonderful, because a lot of the questions that I asked were because I went to colleagues and said, what questions should I ask? And they would tell me, they had these experiences, and some of them had more expertise, and they would say, you ought to do this. And we have a wonderful profession because everyone is always willing to do that. I don't ever recall a time where I ever tried to call anybody in our business that they didn't try to help me. And I hope that they would say the same about me as well.
Well, that has always been one of the reasons I've enjoyed being a law librarian throughout my career, was the friendships you make with so many people.
Yeah,
And not just academic directors, but all through academic libraries and in other types of law libraries. And we're so supportive of each other.
We absolutely are, and the association makes a lot of that possible because we're not segmented in terms of, we're all members of the association. There are obviously special interest sections, but you end up on committees, for example, if you want to get professionally active with librarians from lots of different specialties. And so you make these contacts with people in other specialties, and it's extremely helpful. And as you say, Pat, quite correctly, it doesn't matter what specialty you're in, you're still going to be extremely helpful when someone asks you.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot of what we did, or what I did, was trial and error, but it was less error because I had colleagues who were willing to tell me, you ought to do this, and you ought to talk to this person. And sometimes there would be a tree of calls. You would say, I don't know about this, but talk to so-and-so. And maybe I didn't know so-and-so, but when I call so-and-so and say, this director said I should talk to you, all of a sudden it was like we were old friends.
Yeah.
And so they would help me too. So that's the way we progressed.
It is one of the attractions of being in the law library.
Absolutely.
And maybe other fields are the same way, but I'm not sure that they all are. And,
I don't think they are. I think we're fairly unique. I just look at, I remember the situation in the law firms, for example. Everything was, was fairly competitive and cutthroat, and I'm not sure it's much different between the law schools as well. But law librarians are not like that. You don't hesitate to call a competitor, so to speak, colleague. The schools are competitors, but you don't feel you're a competitor.
We've talked about several of your jobs. Now, you came to Widener in 2008.
Right.
You want to talk a little bit about what you are doing here now?
Sure. Well, it was interesting how I came to Widener, first of all. I came to Widener because my colleague at Cleveland Marshall Linda Emmons became the dean here. And when Linda came here, she said, I don't know what's going on in that law library. She said, Michael, can you become a consultant for me? And I said, I'd be glad to do it, Linda. So I came out and I became a consultant. And when a few months after I did the job for her, she called me up. She said, Michael, I'd really like to talk you into coming out here. So we came here, and it's been, an interesting job. One of the things I'm really proud of is that when I came here, this job was not, the previous director did not have faculty status. And one of my conditions in coming, because I believe very strongly in this, and I believe very strongly in faculty status for the director, I said, unless it's a faculty status position, I can't come. And of course, I was a tenured professor already. And so they changed the position. Now we see so many jobs that are going the opposite way now. So I'm really glad I took one for the team and took one back for the team.
We'll talk about this in a few minutes, because you have done some writing and you've done some service, which are the sorts of things that faculty members are sort of expected
Sure.
to do.
Absolutely.
And many of our colleagues, perhaps in turning down tenure track positions, do so because they don't feel they can go about some of those activities
Right.
effectively. That, you know, I'm running the law library, so I don't have time
Right.
to write or something. And,
Right.
which I think is, you know, unfortunate in some ways, because you're not quite at the same table
Yeah.
if you're not part of the faculty either.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most seriously damaging trends for our profession. You might know that trying to figure out many years ago how to become a law library director, I wrote an article called "The Career Paths of Law Library Directors." It's
Yes.
really a study, mostly because I was trying to figure out how to do this. And at the time I did that study, there were almost no directors who didn't have faculty status. Now, I've been doing a 25-year redo of that study, and I'm shocked at how many people don't have faculty status now. It's certainly not the majority of people, but it's a very substantial number, and I don't have the final numbers yet on that. But I think it's a very bad trend for us. And you're right, you don't sit at the same table. When you don't sit at the same table, you don't have the same kind of influence. And the influence is not for us, I don't think. The influence is for what we can do for the school, what we can do for the students, and particularly what we can do for our staff. And that's, I think, lacking. And I know some of our colleagues will strongly disagree with me for saying that, but I do believe it, and I think the people who don't believe what I'm saying are people who have not experienced faculty status to see what they think about the negatives. I think maybe too much, and don't think about the positives.
Yeah.
Maybe they just haven't experienced the positives. But having Roger as my mentor, I certainly knew, you know, what an influence, what a leader he was within the law school.
Well, you know, Roger was a leader, took a leadership role in trying to establish with the American Bar Association what being a regular member of the faculty meant, which was the standard at the time for libraries and schools. Roger was on the council of the section of legal education admissions to the bar. Jane Hammond, I think, was his predecessor. She was still around, and I was the AELL observer, official observer. So the three of us were at the council meetings when they were discussing, not recently, but you know, about 20 years ago, the issue that comes up periodically, and that is, what about law library directors? Should they be faculty members? And if so, should they also be tenure track, faculty members? And we were able at the time to present a case that the council accepted, that this was the role and this was the appropriate way to structure things. But I understand that's been up for review again more recently, and I don't know what the final disposition will be. I don't think anyone does for sure yet.
Yeah, I don't think so, although it seems to be leaning more towards keeping the status quo, but unfortunately, the ABA has not really enforced the status quo. So that's the standard. They shall be, but they don't really enforce it. So if a school wants to do something else, they're not really, don't seem to be censored for it, which is a problem. But I've done the research, and I go back in time to see when the shift occurred, and it was largely led by some of the real giants of our profession, but also by certain deans who understood, the professionalization of the law library was so important.
Yeah.
And I think we that was hard fought, and so I really hate to see it eroding, because so many people, really put themselves out there to get what we eventually.
You mentioned certain deans played a key role. That happened when we were discussing it 20 years ago or so. The dean at the time at the University of California at Berkeley was a very strong advocate of the law librarian being a real faculty member in the right sense of that term, and he's still the law librarian. But of course, who was the law librarian? None other than Bob Baring, and she kept citing, you know, what he was contributing and all the things he did,
Right.
in addition to being the head of the law library. And,
Right.
you know, that was her goal, and she helped us actually make the case
Yes.
at that time.
Yes. Well, one of the things I do believe is when you are a law library director that contributes tremendously to your school, you're going to have that support, not just from the faculty, which we talked about, but also from the dean. And I think where a lot of the times I see the tenure being loosened is when a dean leaves and they bring a new dean in. Oftentimes a dean who maybe hasn't had that kind of relationship with a librarian, and they come in and they tell the faculty, oh, we can save money or save whatever by changing it. And so I think that happens quite a bit with when a law library director leaves, and it's almost concurrently a new dean comes in. It seems to rear its ugly head. I will refer to it as an ugly head quite a bit.
Well, I won't clip that out in editing. I think you're probably quite right.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, you've been here now since '68. I mean, not '68, I'm thinking back too
Right.
far, 2008.
Yes.
Are you involved in other things on the campus at this point?
Yeah.
Faculty governance sorts of things?
It's a phenomenon, I think, of being around a long time. Now, I have been around a long time. Sometimes that's hard for me to believe, but it's true.
30 years in the field, that sort of makes you an old timer.
It does, and boy, it seems like yesterday I was at Notre Dame, so it does seem, it's incredible to me. But when you have that kind of experience, and I think particularly when you come from other schools, I find that your opinion really seems to matter to the faculty and to the administrators and others. So if you're willing to give that opinion, and I certainly am, you tend to be involved in lots of things that go beyond the law library. And working with Steve Steinglass at Cleveland Marshall, he made sure that I wasn't just the law library director, even just the technology director. I was involved in all the deliberations in the law school, and so I certainly have brought that here. And Linda Ammons was also an associate dean with me at Cleveland Marshall, so she was used to me working in that way. But I find that I'm involved in so many things outside of the law library now that sometimes I kind of forget that I'm the law library director, because curriculum, for example, is a good example. I've been involved in all kinds of curriculum activities and leadership roles and committee roles, and it's been very rewarding. But I actually find that after all these years, I actually have things to contribute to those conversations and experiences.
Well, it would be helpful if the library and the curriculum somehow coordinated one with the other.
Yes, it does, and fortunately, my opinion, I think, is valued. And one of the things I really appreciate, and I've always appreciated, is when your colleagues, when your faculty colleagues, your teaching faculty colleagues see you as a colleague, you get a lot more done. You're a lot more effective in your regular job. The proof in the pudding is that when you start getting elected to faculty committees, and I was just elected to a faculty committee, for example, a couple of weeks ago, that means that they're really looking at you and saying, you're...
They see you as someone
Yes.
who's going to contribute in a positive way.
That's right.
Sure.
That's right. So I'm involved in lots of things, and of course, nowadays we do have a lot of involvement with the university, and so because of my areas, if anything comes up in technology that involves the law school, for example, as a university committee, I'm going to be asked to represent the law school.
Let's shift a little bit while we're speaking sort of outside of the normal direct role of being the director and these other activities. What's it like to have another campus completely 200 miles away or thereabouts?
It's 100 miles, yeah.
100
It's 100 miles away.
Harrisburg.
It's difficult. I have one big advantage is that I have, well, maybe two. First is that law librarians are law librarians, and they work extremely cooperatively. The second is I have a terrific associate director who's actually the day-to-day director by the name of Pat Fox. And so I can really rely on her. I don't have to worry about things. But where it's difficult is communication, coordination is tough. And you can't spend the time at both campuses. You just can't do it. They're too far apart. And that is that's very difficult for someone like me who is used to really working closely with the faculty and the administration. I'm not the only administrator that has that problem. We have a number of administrators who have two campus responsibilities, and they would all tell you the same thing. That makes it tough. So when I go down there, it's like they're glad to see me, but they don't quite know me so well. When I'm here, it's like I'm home.
Yeah.
And but that does weigh on me a bit because I want the other people in Harrisburg to think of me the way the people here do. And to them, I think they respect me, but it's more I'm coming for a visit as opposed to I'm really a member of the
Plus,
faculty.
you have to be their advocate too from time to time.
I do.
I guess would be useful to have a good, some sort of a sense of what's exactly going on in the place.
I do, and I try to get a lot of that from Pat, Pat Fox. But there's no substitute for being in a building. And when you come down only occasionally, and you have to leave by 4 o'clock to beat the long traffic on the turnpike, it's difficult to do that. So it's very much a challenge, and it's probably why there aren't a lot of schools that have that kind of setup.
No, it's sort of unusual. I talked last year to somebody who had 2 branches, but they were just like 25 miles apart or something. She could go back and forth and did.
Yeah.
But yours is a little more long distance.
It's long enough to make it difficult. It's not too long though that you're not expected to be there on certain occasions. So but every time you go, I mean, you're really taking away a day from here. So you can't really give total responsibility or total concentration to either one of the campuses. So it's a juggling act. But I think because of my colleagues like Pat Fox, I think we've been able to be pretty successful with it. I hope so anyway.
Okay. Why don't we talk a little about some of your broader work in the profession? You've been president of the Ohio Regional Association of Law Librarians, I guess when you were up in Cleveland.
Actually, that was when I was at Notre Dame.
In Notre Dame, that's right, they're in part of.
Has a strange name, but it was Michigan, Indiana, obviously Ohio, and Kentucky.
And you were treasurer at one point of the New England Law Library Consortium.
Right.
You've chaired several of the ALL's committees. You've talked a little bit briefly about some of that. You want to talk a little bit about your professional involvement?
Sure. Well, as I was saying before in our conversation, it's one of the joys of having these opportunities to be in this profession is that you get to do service. And of course, if you love your profession, and I think I do, and certainly I'm sure you do, and most of us who have been in this business love it, you want to give back. The great thing is our association is small enough that you can do it, and you can rise to a leadership role without being in a profession for 30 years to do it. So I had a lot of these leadership roles when I was 3 or 4 years into the profession. Basically, people were glad to give me the opportunities to do it, and the contacts you make are invaluable. The opportunities to make a difference, is extraordinary. I think within this profession. I don't think you really get as much of an opportunity. And if I was trying to do this in the ABA, for example, I mean, I have been involved in
You've
some
had
ABA.
some background there too.
I have, yes, but it's largely because I've been known in the law library field,
Sure.
to do that. So that's been terrific. And because we don't have paid staffs at most of these associations, you got to do everything. And so some of the most extraordinary examples of doing that have been planning annual meetings, like the ORAL annual meeting or the ALSIS. When I was president of chair, I should say, of ALSIS, I had to plan the annual reception meeting and so on. You do have somebody who's a local arrangements person, but you have to do everything from soup to nuts, from the education programs. You got to get all the speakers and and the timing and everything. It's an extraordinary amount of work without much support to do it. And while you're doing it, you're thinking, why did I agree to do this? But when you're done with it, you're thinking, this is such great experience, and you really made a contribution. The most interesting one, was a little bit funny, I think, anyway, was when I did the oral one. Of course, I wasn't that experienced at the time. And I did get help from my colleagues at Notre Dame, but we did the oral meeting, and I thought I had a really good educational program. And almost no one said no when I asked them to speak, which is also typical, I think, of our profession. And so we did this thing, and I was just so proud, that I pulled it off. And we, of course, had the comment sheets that people filled out. And when I got back, I looked at the first comment sheet, and I was thinking, boy, they're going to be praising me for the educational program. And I looked at it and said, why are there no choice of salad dressings? You need to have choices of salad dressings. And that was kind of, wow. That was
Somehow
the
you didn't think that was what you needed to focus on primarily.
I
huh?
didn't, but I realized, the details were important to a lot of people, but maybe that one wasn't that important, but it's a little bit kind of, making you realize that
This is why if you aspire to leadership roles, you have to have a thick skin.
you do. That's a good way to put it, and I think I learned from that experience as well. But in fairness, I also got comments, good job,
Oh, yeah.
and so on. But
Yeah.
the first one was the salad dressing, so.
Well, anytime you read evaluations, there'll be, many of them will be more or less positive. At least you hope they will be.
Yes.
But there may be some that are not.
Yes, that's right.
You just can't always satisfy everybody
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah. But if someone would have said to me, I didn't like this program or I didn't like the speaker, but the salad dressing that was really kind of, I don't know, it just got to me at the time. I was probably pretty tired anyway, but.
Well, you've been working like crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
This is what you did not need to read.
That's right. That's right. Now I look back, I don't think it was pretty funny, but yeah, but they're great experience, and I think when I look back on my career, when I hopefully retire at some point, I think those are the kinds of things I'm really going to be most proud of. Is that I was able to have some leadership roles in a profession that I just love.
Well, you have been a faculty member. We've talked a little bit about that, but you teach as well.
Yes.
You want to talk a little briefly about some of that?
Sure. I mean, when I first got into it, teaching was all-encompassing to me. It was hard, but I also thought, I had this vision in my mind that students were really anxious to learn about legal research. And I was trying to become an expert in legal research. I had the Cohen and Baring tome on legal research, and I spent an entire summer getting ready for my first teaching, which was a standalone legal research, introduction to legal research course at Notre Dame, by just outlining and underlining it over and over again this book to learn everything, all the pearls of wisdom. And so that's how we started out with Jim Gates, who's now the librarian at the Baseball Hall of Fame, and we were the two librarians that taught every law student legal research in a standalone course at Notre Dame. And we were crazy because not only did we overestimate the student interest, but we went to the administration and we asked them, could we teach an extra half hour, or, no credit, but require the students to come? And they said, we don't care. So we did, but the students cared, and our evaluations, of course, the evaluations reflected the fact we only did that 1 year.
Yeah.
So that was my first experience in teaching, was the introduction to legal research. When I moved over to Suffolk, they had a full-time staff of legal research and writing professors, and they weren't really interested in librarians teaching. There was a status kind of
They may have been a tiny bit threatened by it.
There was a lot of that at that time. I think a lot of that's dissipated, but at that time they were just getting started as their own profession. So I thought, well, what can I teach? And I thought, well, I'll just call it advanced legal research, basically teach what I was teaching, maybe with some more specialization, because I didn't think the students were getting very much of legal research. It was mostly a legal writing course, as far as I could tell by sort of studying what they were doing. So I did that all the time that I was at Suffolk. When I moved to Cleveland Marshall, I continued to teach that course. The other thing I always try to do was get my staff involved once I became a director and get them teaching, which I think that's very important for them, both their relationship with students, but also for their expertise. But after a while, I kind of got tired of teaching that course, so I thought, I'd like to teach something more substantive. But what can I teach that's substantive? Well, I've always had this tremendous interest in history, and so I was thinking legal history, but I had a particular interest in the American Civil War.
Okay.
And I'd been going to the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. I've gone there 9 times, which is a week of intensive study with the big experts in the area. And what I learned from going there was, boy, there's a lot of legal issues involved in this, and most people don't know about them. They don't know what Abraham Lincoln did, for example, against civil liberties, and they don't understand about secession, and they didn't know the first income tax came in, or the first military draft, or paper currency was not legal until it was instituted. So I found all these issues, and so I created this course when I was my last year at Cleveland Marshall, and I went to them and asked if I could teach it, and they said sure. So I taught it. And so when I came here, they asked me, he said, because you're a faculty member, you got to teach. They said, what do you want to teach? And I said, this is my course. And they said, sounds interesting, okay. So I've been teaching it now, this is the 6th year in a row. I've been teaching it here, and I taught it once at Cleveland Marshall. So it's the 7th time I've taught this course.
I bet you still spend a lot of time
Tremendous
boning
amount of
up on
time.
it and learning new things and planning your classes and
Tremendous amount of time.
evolving,
Yeah.
letting the course evolve. Yeah.
And it's a real challenge because it's not just legal history, it's largely a constitutional law course. So I had to learn a lot more
Yeah.
than I knew before about constitutional law.
And some of the stuff is coming out recently in the press about, the CIA's interrogation of some of the people after the 9/11.
Exactly right.
Maybe some of those same issues are coming back around.
They are the same issues, and a lot of my students will actually write comparative pieces where they look at what happened during the Civil War, and they will either trace it through our history, because this stuff comes up almost every time we have a war, or they'll just look at the contemporary issues and compare them. So it's turned out to be very relevant for the students as well, and I really enjoy it. So it's given me a certain cachet, I think, with the faculty, moving
It
outside
does.
of legal research as well.
I mean, you're a stand-up teacher.
Yes.
I was, and you have a legitimacy with your colleagues in the faculty if you do sort of what they do.
And it's really interesting. You're right, and it's really interesting because sometimes I'll be surprised when faculty members turn to me and ask me for substantive advice on constitutional law issues, because they actually do consider that I'm pretty knowledgeable about certain areas, and that's very gratifying as well.
Yeah. Well, we're sort of nearing the end of our conversation today. There are topics we could talk about, but I think maybe rather than my bringing them up, I might ask you, Michael, if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to bring up at this point.
Well, thank you. That's a very generous offer. One thing I guess I would like to say, maybe for posterity, maybe for people who are looking at this, in the near future. We touched on the fact that there's lots of challenges with librarianship, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are in the profession to deal with those challenges and to find ways that we can expand our role and be as useful to the law school as possible. So, I know some of our colleagues are worried that maybe law libraries aren't going to exist in the future. I don't believe that's the case as long as you keep finding a vital role for yourself, and I think there's plenty of opportunities to do that. The other thing I just want to kind of maybe elaborate a little bit more on a point we were making about status. I think status is so important, and I wish, and I know a lot of our colleagues agree with me on that based on the listserv discussions and so on, but I wish we would, and this may be for our younger colleagues, I wish they would think twice before they accept these positions without status. And I think it really weakens the profession, and I'm really thinking almost as a caretaker at this point. I know what I inherited from people like you and Roger and Roy Mursky and Dick Danner and so many others, great leaders in our profession. And I hate to be in the generation that kind of let it go away. And I hope we can make a better case for our own colleagues so that they realize that, accepting these positions, and I know everybody has their own individual reasons why they do things, but on principle, I won't interview. I'm not going anywhere anymore, so that's, Linda Ammons, don't worry about that.
You never know.
At this point, I don't expect to go anywhere, but the point really is that I don't accept any kind of interviews that lesson status.
Mm-hmm.
And other than full faculty statuses, and I'm not saying I'm the be-all and end-all, because I'm not, but I wish other colleagues would realize how important that is, and they don't fall into that trap, because I think it really is the one thing I think that can totally undermine our positions.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to think of a world where we don't sit at the table, where we
Yeah.
don't have the opportunities to contribute. I think it really hurts the law school when that happens, Pat, and I think somehow that we need to get that message across, because I think some of these deans, when they come in, they don't understand it because they haven't worked with a really good law library staff before, and they don't realize what they can do.
Well, I think on that note, I'll add one little tidbit, and that
Sure.
is sometimes as director, we have to talk truth to power, I think is how it's phrased in Washington DC and places. And that is better done, in my opinion, and more effectively if you are at the table, as we keep phrasing it quite aptly. You're a real faculty member. You are probably tenured, or you will be at some point if you're just beginning a career. And that's important, because sometimes you have to say what needs to be said. You have to present the case, and it may be politically a little difficult. So it's better to be in a position where you can take on that role, which is the same reason faculty are given tenure, so they do have the freedom of doing what needs to be done in the classroom and in their writing.
That's extremely well said, and it's exactly true. And I've seen directors of university libraries, for example, just totally not be able to do what it is they know they should do, because they're so worried about the political repercussions for doing it. The other thing I guess I would just close in saying is that for the young librarians who are moving up, who think that it's so hard to be a director, or it's too hard to be a director, there's so many of us who disprove that theory. You know, I'm not saying it isn't difficult sometimes, but it's so rewarding to be at the table. It's so rewarding to do the scholarship. It's so rewarding to do the teaching. It's so rewarding to be a faculty member that I couldn't understand why anybody would choose the opposite approach.
Mm-hmm.
Your job's going to be hard no matter what you do, especially nowadays. So why not go all the way and, you know, as I said before, reap the benefits and not dwell so much on the fact that it's going to be a lot of work. I find that faculties are very fair when it comes to evaluating their librarians, and the status issue is not necessarily always going to be the same in terms of the requirements. Mm-hmm. Some schools it may be, but other schools they certainly make allowances, and everywhere I've been, they've been reasonable about understanding that your role is critically important but different. Mm-hmm. But that does not mean that you should, you know, have the same status as, you know, an administrator without faculty status. So that's an issue I just really think we need to do a better job on.
Well, I think on that, I will thank you, Michael Slinger, for the time you've taken to have this conversation on camera this morning. I want to thank you not only on my behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the honor of talking to people like yourself and putting together this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf on Hein Online.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to do this. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. And I'd also like to thank Michelle, Frank, and certainly Dick and Hein for giving this opportunity. We don't have maybe as many friends and colleagues in publishing anymore, but certainly Hein is one that we can look to and say we still have a friend in Hein. So I really appreciate that.
I think the Hein Company is very special.
I do.
I share your sentiments entirely.
Thank you very much.